I still remember a woman once telling me, very calmly, that her marriage ended on a Tuesday, but she only understood it on a Saturday. That sentence stuck with me longer than I expected, because divorce or separation rarely begins when papers are signed or when someone walks out the door. It begins in the silence before that moment, in the emotional distance, the repeated misunderstandings, the long pauses at dinner tables where conversation used to live. And here's the part most people don't like to admit. When a relationship breaks down, it doesn't just divide two adults, it reorganizes an entire emotional ecosystem. Children feel it first, even when nobody says a word. Friends adjust their loyalty quietly. The home itself starts to feel unfamiliar, like a place that forgot its own rhythm. What makes it even more complicated is that adults often try to manage separation like a checklist: logistics, housing, finances, while emotionally they are still inside a storm they haven't named yet. From my years of observing families going through this, I can tell you something simple but uncomfortable. The biggest damage rarely comes from the separation itself. It comes from how unprepared people are for what the separation does to their emotions, their identity, and most importantly, their children's sense of stability. And once that emotional shock sets in, everything else becomes harder than it looks on paper. The first thing I usually notice after a separation is not what people say, it's what they don't feel right away, or rather, what they refuse to admit they are feeling. There is this strange emotional delay, like the mind hasn't received the full message yet. One person is already packing bags, changing routines, or making legal arrangements, while the other is still mentally arguing in conversations that have already ended. That mismatch creates a kind of emotional confusion that people often mistake for being strong. But it isn't strength, it's shock. In psychology, this is often linked to acute stress responses. The brain, when overwhelmed, doesn't process everything at once. It prioritizes survival over understanding. So instead of sadness showing up immediately, you get numbness or irritation or a sudden obsession with staying busy, anything that delays the emotional impact. Then, when reality finally settles in, it doesn't arrive gently. It comes in waves. Some people describe it as waking up and briefly forgetting what happened, only for it to hit them again like it's new information. Others experience it in smaller, quieter ways, seeing a shared object in the house and suddenly feeling their chest tighten, or realizing they no longer need to check in with someone they used to speak to every day. And here's where it becomes emotionally complex. There is no socially recognized death, but there is still grief. That's what many people struggle with. The mind doesn't know where to place the loss. Nothing is buried, nothing is formally ended in the emotional sense, yet something deeply familiar has disappeared. So the grief becomes invisible, and because it's invisible, people often judge themselves for feeling it. I've seen adults say things like, I shouldn't be this affected, or I thought I was over it by now, as if emotional recovery is supposed to follow a straight line. It doesn't. Anger often shows up next, not necessarily because the situation is getting worse, but because anger gives structure to confusion. It turns emotional chaos into something more focused, something you can aim at, something that feels easier to hold than sadness. But underneath all of it, anger, distraction, numbness, there is usually a quieter layer most people avoid sitting with: grief for the version of life they thought they were building. And until that layer is acknowledged, everything else tends to repeat in cycles. One of the most misunderstood things about separation is this: adults think children are resilient because they adapt quickly on the surface. New routines, new rooms, new schedules. Life keeps moving. But children are not adapting emotionally as fast as they are adapting behaviorally. I've seen this pattern repeat so many times that it almost becomes predictable. A child who suddenly becomes very quiet, Another who becomes unusually loud, almost disruptive. One who starts asking strangely deep questions like, "Did I do something wrong?" And the one that worries me the most, the child who acts completely fine. Because fine is often just silence with good acting skills. From a psychological standpoint, children interpret family separation through a very self centered lens, not out of selfishness, but development. Especially in younger children, there is a cognitive stage where they naturally assume they are connected to everything that happens around them. So, when a home changes, their first internal conclusion is not, "My parents are having issues," but "Something in me caused this." Teenagers are slightly different, but not necessarily better at coping. They often swing between emotional detachment and sudden emotional outbursts. One moment, they're acting like they don't care. The next, they're reacting intensely to small triggers. What's happening underneath is emotional overload combined with a need for control. If the home feels unstable, they try to stabilize themselves by controlling what they can: friends, appearance, independence, or emotional withdrawal. And then there's the behavioral language children use when they cannot express what they feel: a drop in academic performance, increased irritability, sleeping too much or too little, or subtle regression, like a younger child suddenly becoming clingy again, or a teenager becoming unusually dependent on one parent. None of these behaviors are random. They are communication attempts. The challenge is that most adults are also emotionally overwhelmed during separation, so they often misinterpret these signals. What is actually anxiety gets labeled as attitude. What is actually fear gets labeled as disrespect. And what is actually confusion gets labeled as bad behavior. This is where attachment theory becomes important, even in a simple sense. Children build internal emotional maps based on stability. When that stability is disrupted, they don't immediately lose love for their parents, but they can lose trust in predictability. And that unpredictability can quietly shape how they relate to relationships in the future. What makes this even more delicate is that children rarely ask directly for reassurance in obvious ways. Instead, they test, they repeat questions, they seek attention in indirect forms, or they watch closely to see if adults are still emotionally available even when things are falling apart. And if that emotional availability disappears too, the impact is not immediate drama, it's quiet internal adjustment, the kind that doesn't show up until much later in life, in relationships, trust issues, or emotional avoidance. Which is why, in separation, what children experience emotionally is often more important than what they are told verbally. One of the most damaging illusions during separation is the belief that harm only happens during arguments. Loud voices, slammed doors, heated exchanges, those are visible, so people assume those are the worst moments. But in reality, the most emotionally corrosive phase is what happens after the decision is made, when communication continues, but only in fragments, tension, or coded hostility. I once observed a situation where two separated parents barely spoke directly anymore. On the surface, it looked peaceful: no shouting, no confrontation. But every message passed through the child. Every request, every complaint, every adjustment in schedule became a delivery system for emotional tension. That's what I call the invisible war, because children become accidental translators of adult emotions they were never meant to carry. And here's the psychological problem: children are not neutral messengers. Even if they say nothing, they absorb tone, timing, and emotional weight. A simple message like, "Tell your father I said he's late again," doesn't stay simple in a child's mind. It becomes layered with meaning, pressure, and emotional responsibility. Over time, this creates what psychologists often describe as loyalty conflict, where a child feels, consciously or unconsciously, that being close to one parent might mean betraying the other. Even if nobody explicitly says that, the emotional environment can imply it. This is where communication style after separation becomes more important than communication frequency. I've seen families who barely interact but maintain calm, neutral, structured communication, and the children adjust relatively well. And I've also seen families who communicate constantly, but through sarcasm, indirect criticism, or emotional residue, and the children remain tense, even when everything looks organized. The key issue is emotional contamination. When adults cannot separate their unresolved feelings from practical communication, every interaction becomes layered with subtext. And children, even when they pretend not to notice, are very sensitive to subtext. There is also another subtle pattern: using children as emotional barometers, asking them questions not for information, but for reassurance or validation. Things like trying to read the other parent's life through the child's answers. It sounds harmless in the moment, but psychologically, it places the child in a role they cannot safely hold. What often gets overlooked is that post separation communication is not about closure, it is about containment. Containing emotional reactions, containing unresolved resentment, containing the need to win old arguments that no longer matter in practical terms. Because the moment communication becomes a continuation of the relationship conflict instead of a tool for coordination, children become the environment where that conflict quietly lives on. And children don't process invisible wars as adults do. They don't analyze it, they internalize it. There is a moment in separation that doesn't get enough attention. It's not the moment of conflict or the moment someone leaves. It's the moment after everything becomes quiet. Because silence, surprisingly, is where identity starts to shake. When a long term relationship ends, people don't just lose a partner, they lose a structure, a role, a rhythm of daily existence that was built over years. And what replaces it at first is not clarity, it's disorientation. I've seen people describe it in very practical terms: forgetting what time they usually eat, feeling strange in familiar rooms, or reaching for habits that no longer have a recipient. Even decision making becomes heavier because so many decisions were once shared, even silently. Psychologically, this is what we call identity reorganization under loss. The mind has to rebuild a sense of who I am now without the relational mirror it used to depend on. And that process can be uncomfortable because identity doesn't rebuild neatly. It rebuilds in fragments. One of the most common mistakes I observe is rushing the stage. People try to immediately replace the loss with distraction, new routines, new relationships, excessive productivity, or emotional suppression disguised as moving on. But unprocessed identity loss doesn't disappear just because life gets busy. It waits, and it often shows up later in unexpected ways: emotional reactivity, difficulty trusting new relationships, or a constant feeling of being in between phases of life. What actually helps during this stage is not speed, but structure. Small, consistent anchors that rebuild personal stability. Simple routines that don't depend on emotional motivation. Predictability in daily life that slowly teaches the nervous system that life is still stable, even if the relationship structure has changed. Another overlooked aspect is social identity. After separation, people often notice shifts in how they are perceived by friends, family, or even themselves in social settings. Invitations may change, conversations may shift tone, and there can be an uncomfortable feeling of being reintroduced into your own life as a different version of yourself. This is where emotional reframing becomes important, not in a forced positive way, but in a practical psychological way. Understanding that identity is not destroyed by separation, it is reorganized by it. And while adults are dealing with this internal reconstruction, children are observing something even more subtle. They are learning what emotional recovery looks like, not from what is said, but from how life is lived afterward. If they see chaos, they learn instability. If they see calm structure returning slowly, they learn resilience. So, rebuilding identity after separation is not only personal, it becomes quietly instructional for the next generation watching from the edges of the experience. So, when people talk about divorce or separation, they often focus on the event itself, the decision, the arguments, the paperwork, the visible ending. But what actually matters more is everything that happens after the ending, because separation is not a single moment. It is a psychological transition that unfolds in layers: emotional shock, hidden grief, children trying to make sense of changes they didn't choose, communication patterns that either calm or prolong emotional tension, and finally, the slow rebuilding of identity on both sides. And if there is one truth I have learned from watching families go through this process, it is this: children don't need perfection after separation. They need emotional stability, predictability, and adults who are not constantly leaking unresolved conflict into their daily environment. It won't always be easy. Some days will feel controlled, other days will feel like progress is invisible. But emotional recovery rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up quietly in calmer conversations, more stable routines, and children slowly returning to themselves. If this resonated with you in any way, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. I often read them closely and I respond when I can. And if you find value in understanding the psychology behind parenting, relationships, and adolescent behavior in real life situations like this, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep these conversations going and keeps more people aware that behind every separation story, there is always a deeper human process unfolding underneath it.